Hello, long time no see. Welcome back to Tired Format. I'm Jason, and today we're going to talk a bit more about living with and owning an A2. Can I help you, dog? I know you want to get on my lap. There we go. Cool. Sit down. Good lad. Right. I've actually written notes for this. I'm more than prepared, so yeah, I actually already recorded a bit of a video on this, but I did it with my GoPro on my old commute, so it sounded like garbage. You couldn't hear a thing I was saying. So I thought I'd do another one. I've got multiple microphones, as you can see. I've got one there, one there. Hopefully between them we can get some good audio, hey? So yeah, the Audi A2. I've already done a video sort of introducing it and giving you a bit of an overview of what the car was about and that sort of stuff. So this is purely what it's like to actually live with one. If you're looking at buying one and you found this video, this is sort of like the next stage on for knowing what it's about, the history and all that gumph. This is actually someone living with one, their opinion of it. And I need to start things with a bit of a disclaimer. The one I bought was a bit of a pup. I think mine is starting to crunch into thirds. In fact, it was what I would call a wrong one. I tried adjusting the gear linkage and I've made it worse. It had a lot of issues. The guy who sold it was less than honest, let's just say. And I've spent well over $1,000, more than that even, getting it to a stage now where it is actually an alright, decent car, and it's still not great. So yeah, I broke this down into a few sections. I've got the costings of running it, I've got what it's like to drive, how practical it is, and then I've gone for some good and bads as well. And then right at the end, I will talk about some of the modifications I did, because not everyone wants to modify their car, but if you do, there'll be a timestamp in here to talk about the ones I've done to mine. So let's go at it, shall we? So first off, cost. They used to be sub £1,000 cars to buy. They're not anymore. Not just because of inflation. They were a rare car, new-ish, and they're even rarer now. So what you might find is a lot of them have had a period of life where they've been very cheap. People have used them as little beaters because they do take a lot of punishment. And because of that, there's a lot of bad cars out there, as I can attest to. So yeah, to buy, they are around the £2,000 mark now for a semi-decent one. You can get bad ones for less than that. I would probably be looking at the £2,000 to £3,000 mark on the day this is being filmed for a decent runner that's going to have a lot of work done on it that you may not want to do. To run. Cost to run, that is. Peanuts, really peanuts. And I'm talking specifically about my one here, which is the 1.4 TDI with, it's the 75 brake horsepower diesel basically, and they do a 90 as well. I know that mine's 30 quid a year to tax, and also my last tank was 65 mile per gallon, and that's calculated. It's not looking at any trip computers or anything, that's just purely calculated using Fuely. I got 65 mile per gallon at my last tank, and I drive like a bit of a tip. So if you're a more careful driver, you could probably get more than that. Now, some of that might be down to the mods I have. Arguable, really. I think standard cars will easily do 60 mile per gallon plus. So, yeah, to run, dirt cheap. As for parts costs, it varies, and I'll get into that with the good and the bad. For the most part, they share a lot of things with the Polo. So you're looking at Volkswagen Audi parts prices, but there's a lot of aftermarket out there stuff, there's a lot of aftermarket stuff out there for cheap. However, for quite a small car, compared to something like a Toyota or something French maybe, the parts prices are a bit higher. It's an Audi, it's a Volkswagen Audi product. If you do a bit of cross-referencing and you're smart about it, you can get some good deals on parts. So up to you, obviously. A lot of the cheaper parts are rubbish, as I found out with my clutch, but you get what you pay for, don't you? So now I'll move on to what it's like to drive. I realise a lot of people will want these just as a practical runabout or a commuter, and they are a pretty comfortable car. My one obviously has had different suspension on it, and when I had it, it had no shock absorbent whatsoever, so I've never really had the full comfort from it, from an SE suspension anyway. But as for handling, they are fantastic. A little over a tonne and 75 horsepower and a load of torque is more than enough to have fun. With the remap, it's even more fun, and of course I put the coilovers on there so it's super stiff. I just never have to brake. It's just such a shame a lot of new cars are so heavy now, because it just shows, just removing weight, how much that gives you, you know, not just fuel economy on performance, but also how fun they are to drive. You know, it's just, yeah, that's a rant for another day, though, about heavy cars and things. Practicality. It's easily the most practical car you can find of its class. Because of its boxy-ish shape, there's plenty of headroom for tall people like me, even in the back. And then there's the magic that goes on in the boot, where you've got a separate boot floor, a false floor with more storage underneath that, and then you can fold the seats flat, which obviously gives you a lot more room. But you can also flip the seats up and remove the seats, and when you remove the false floor, you basically end up with a van. It's huge. It really is. So yeah, as a practical car, it ticks a lot of boxes. You've got MPG, it's refined, it's got fantastic interior space and configurations to suit whatever you need it for. So yeah, it's quite a praise at the moment for the car. There's a lot of praising going on, but don't worry. And they're on the good and bad section. So I've said some of the good stuff already, as you know, but there's some other bits that I thought were worth mentioning. So one of the things I love about this car is the fact that they just don't rust. It being an all aluminium body, any other Audi or Volkswagen of that age will have succumbed to some, you know, wheel arch or sill corrosion, things like that. Obviously, there is still the chance of corrosion on the steel parts, but you've got to remember a lot of these steel parts, even the biggest bits like the subframes, are completely interchangeable. So in theory, if it rusts, instead of having to pay someone to cut and weld stuff, you can just swap it out with a new part. Having said that, it's still, aluminium does corrode. You've got to look out for galvanic corrosion between, you know, anything that's steel that bolts through it will want to corrode if you don't use the right screws with the right coating on. So that's important to remember. A lot of these kits come with screws when you're changing bushes and things that might not be correct. I'd always recommend getting any bolts from the manufacturer themselves. So I get mine from TPS, Trade Part Services, which is Volkswagen, and they're super cheap, and you know they've got the right coating on them, so win-win. That's for any car really, but in particular Volkswagens, I find them really cheap. And as I said previously, it does share a lot of parts with the Polo, an Ibiza, a Fabia. There's loads of interchangeable bits, which I love about Volkswagens in general. They are a bit like Lego. You can just pick and choose which parts you want depending on price, and you can even customise the car by tweaking it slightly, like I've done with the gearbox. That's not for every part. There's certain parts that are A2 specific. And that's where I move on to my bad. So my first point with the bad is that there are a lot of specific parts to that car. The obvious stuff is interior trim and bodywork. You can't get most of it new. There's some of it is on the Audi Heritage website, but it's ludicrously expensive. So you're basically relying on a supply of scrapped cars to keep your car on the road. Not such a bad thing. There's quite a few out there. As I say, they got cheap, they got misused, they got abused, and then they got scrapped. So there are parts out there. I've not had a problem finding parts so far via like the owners forums and things. There's a couple of breakers on there that are very good. But yeah, you just got to watch out because not everything is cross-compatible. But as I say, most of the mechanical stuff is. There's a few specific parts, but yeah. They do have their issues, these cars, and I know my car's had a lot of issues, but I just want to run down the ones that are pretty common for these cars. So start with the gearbox, obviously, because it's the biggest issue that I have in mine. You have that shifter mech tower, which on most VW Audi cars is fine. Because of the packaging on this one and where the water drains run, you have an issue where the drain pipe coming from the bonnet into the receptacle moves or gets broken or lost when people are working on the car because it's on a bit of a flimsy arm. And yeah, you end up with nothing catching the water except the top of the gearbox on that selector arm. It slowly gets worn away to the point where the bush gets worn away, and then it fills the gearbox up with water. So depending on where you catch that is how lucky you are. As mine was probably one of the worst that you could get in that respect. But when you test drive one of these A2s, if there's a crunch in any of the gears, get the bonnet off, get the bonnet off, and have a look at that selector mech. If it's got any play in it, I'd walk away, or I would be looking at a new gearbox, because you just don't know how far gone the gearbox has gone. It's not even if it's got water in it, but how long has it been misaligned that you've been crunching a gear? Because what happened to mine was had the synchro was completely knackered on third, and actually my mechanic has my old box and he's been opening it up and sending me some pictures. It's not pretty in there. So yeah, that's one major thing I would look out for. There's other stuff which is a bit more sort of depending on the engine you get. So the TDI 90 is the main thing that's different, is they have a dual mass flywheel, and anyone who's owned a car with a dual mass flywheel or looked at one, it's a failure point. It's not a big issue if you're changing a clutch anyway, just something to look out for on the 90s. And then there's the 1.6 FSIs. They're the first of these FSI engines really that VW AG did. So they have their issues. They also have their fixes though, and if they've been looked after and you've had a few mods done, they're actually really fine and probably quite quick actually. I'd like to try one. Yeah, and I think another one for the bad is the fact that they are becoming rarer, and as I said, they're going up in value. So if you are buying one to run on a budget, that's fine, but be aware that you are buying an appreciating asset, which is good, I suppose, but equally I imagine the parts prices are going to start getting more expensive as things get more rare. And finally on the bad, and it's not the car's fault, it's the government and all that stuff, but diesels in particular are becoming harder to drive around in certain cities anyway. So for example, my V8 petrol Range Rover, which is 607 quid a year to tax now, is ULEZ compliant. I don't have to pay the ULEZ. However, I take the A2, which is £30 a year to tax and does all the Marbogans in the world, etc. That I do have to pay ULEZ on. So just an example of how against diesels a lot of these ultra low emission zone things are. And it's the same thing with driving into Oxford. They now have a zero emission zone, so anything with an engine gets a fine. Really, it's a fine, isn't it? But they can say it's a charge. And when I looked the other day, it was the same price for both the Audi and the Range Rover. So yeah, go figure. But yeah, now for all the people who don't want to modify their cars, you can skip to my conclusion, but for the modifications, I think you should stick around really, because there's some really nice little mods you can do to these cars to improve their usability and sort of, I guess, modernise them a bit. Kind of depends what your usage case is, as I'll go through. So my particular car, it had completely knackered suspension, and the cheapest way of changing everything was getting coilovers. I went for Jom. I know they're a cheap brand, but they are a brand. They're a brand that I know of and I've used and people have used for years. So I figured it was a fairly safe option in the budget bracket. I have to say I was very impressed with the coilovers when they arrived for the price. They looked really good quality. They fitted fine other than the car's quirks, and the ride isn't too bad at all. I've got it fairly low and I don't think it's too bad. Now the other thing I have is a remap. It was a generic remap. I unplugged the ECU, sent it off to a guy on the forum. It was very cheap. When it came back, I plugged it in, it instantly worked, instantly more power. I think that's a very good mod to do if you're going to get the gearbox. So the map takes it from 75 to around 100. Obviously you don't know at all, but it definitely is a noticeable boost in power and obviously more torque as well. And as I say, my fuel economy's pretty good since I put it on, so maybe it is helping, I don't know. But yeah, that combined with the JDD code gearbox, so O2J and O2Q and all these other gearbox versions that VAG cars have, they have a 3-letter code afterwards which sort of denotes what gearing it has in it. JDD was used in things like the Fabia Green Line, the Polo Blue Motion, Seat Ecomotive, I think, as well, I've seen when I've been searching for them. It's a 5-speed, but all the ratios are longer. The side effect of that is you often use a lower gear than you think you need to use with it. You have to sort of remember it's kind of like a 6-speed box, but jammed into 5 gears. There are other options. There are 6-speed options depending on what year your car is. There's a 6-speed modification where you can actually modify the box to add a 6-speed in. All of these I think are well worth it because the standard box in 5th is a bit loud. Yeah, you're revving it out quite a lot, which for a little economical diesel isn't great. It's more geared for the city. If your car's going to be driving around a town or a city, you'd probably be absolutely fine with the gearbox, but I would think about it because obviously those gearboxes in the A2s are a known weak point. The later gearbox I've got is way stronger, apparently. So yeah, that's something to think about. The wiper arm, that's another common issue on those where the bearings fail and the arm clatters the windscreen and scratches it quite badly. There's a guy on the forum again, actually the same guy did my remap, and he does a fully refurbished wiper arm with decent bearings and studs in there. So I've got that on there. That's well worth doing because it's going to fail if it hasn't already. So you may as well get the better, stronger arm. He also has them powder coated and things, so they look great. And then finally, I put a TT steering wheel in it, as you know. I find them much nicer than the standard units on those cars. Nice leather steering wheel, 3-spoke. it is a bit nicer. Yeah, in conclusion, I guess the thing would be, would I recommend one to someone else? And I think the answer would be yes. If you're already asking me if an A2 is a good car, you're probably already looking for something interesting, small, maybe rare, practical and economical. It ticks all those boxes. There's not many cars that do that now. A lot of the interesting stuff has gone up in value. Obviously the A2s have, but they're still within most of our reach. So if you're thinking about one, I would really consider going in, looking at some, maybe test driving some. Obviously there's the bad points I mentioned, keep those in mind. It's one of those cars that has surprised me in all the areas it can. It's excelled itself. So that's high praise from someone who's had about 31, 32 cars. I promise you, it really is. I've had some disappointments and I've had some great ones, but this one's one of the good ones. So yeah, I guess that's it really. I'm sorry my uploads haven't been very frequent recently. On a personal note, I've left my last job. I'm now in a new job, hence why I'm sat in my home office, which is still a bit of a mess in terms of wire cable management and what have you, and stuff everywhere. But yeah, I appreciate you bearing with. I've got a few more videos to film coming up. I've got some videos that I've half filmed and fully filmed and lots of stuff to edit, but I thought I'd get this one out there because there's quite a few people who've messaged me since uploading these videos saying, tell me what it's like to live with after a while, tell me about the mods and all that. Yeah, thank you very much for watching as ever. I've got a link to buy me a coffee and you can buy merch and all that usual stuff, but no stress. I'm just grateful that you watch and subscribe and that. So yeah, leave a comment below. What do you think? Am I right about the A2? Have you now considered an A2? Yeah. Guess I press stop on the record.